Hello, everyone. Welcome to our debate on the use of restraints and seclusion for people with autism and other developmental disabilities. Each one of us will be presenting an argument either for or against the use of restraints with this population. Amanda will be summarizing the pro side of the argument, and Nicole will be summarizing the con side. Miguel was the illustrator for our group, Jennifer was the main researcher reviewing literature, and Jeremy is our fielder. My name is Kyla, and I will be helping move things along throughout the debate. There are many negatives and positives when discussing the use of restraints with students who have disabilities. With proper use, restraints can decrease dangerous problem behaviors and protect both the individual and those around them. However, restraints are often viewed as unethical and ineffective. There is also a chance that abuses of power become an issue when restraints are implemented. Jeremy and Jennifer will argue the first main points for and against restraints, starting with Jeremy.
Schuerman et al. State that courts have ruled that individuals have the constitutional right to receive least restrictive treatment that allows for an opportunity to improve their condition. Many times, the length of seclusion is inappropriately long, which prevents students from receiving necessary academic instruction and completing assignments necessary for improving their academic skills. Function-based reinforcement interventions should be applied prior to the use of any form of restraint or seclusion technique. Best practice when using restraints and seclusion techniques includes brief, limited application of these strategies as part of multi-component plans that use function-based reinforcement contingency and team-based decision-making regarding the use of restraint and seclusion implementation. One of the main concerns when using restraints and seclusion in the educational setting is that many students' problem behaviors arise from their lack of understanding of the instructional content, and using restraints and seclusions furthers this deficit.
Okay, as we know, children with autism display a variety of unique behaviors. Some of those behaviors are disruptive and can be dangerous. Pica is one of those behaviors that I'm referring to. Children exhibit pica eat a variety of non-food items such as clay, mud, paper clips, hair, or paint. The behavior is common among those with autism and other developmental disabilities. A review by Matson and his colleagues in 2013 reported that this prevalence is between 4 and 26%. Ingesting non-food items can have very serious negative effects. At its worst, pica may result in the need for surgery and/or death, according to Bell and Stein, 1992. That is why I support the use of restraints for children who exhibit pica. An experimental procedure by McCord, Grosser, Illwater, and Powers, 2005. The title is An Analysis of Response Blocking Parameters in the Prevention of Pica. There were 3 individuals who were in this, who participated in this study. There was Jeremy, who would ingest straws, grass, plants, coins, and other plastic objects. He would also ingest cleaning fluids. There was Gordon, who would ingest leaves, grass, paint chips, dirt, and plastic objects. Also, there was Malcolm, who would ingest cigarette butts. Now, we know that restraint is a physical force used to immobilize or reduce the ability of an individual. The results for this study shows that none of the participants managed to demonstrate pica when their therapist would restrain them. That is why I am in support of restraints, because it eliminated the use of these individuals to harm themselves. I also have a video clip that I would like for us to watch, which further my argument of why restraints are needed.
think it was weird what he was eating?
I'd have to. Do you want a drink? Now that Do you want a drink? Now that we've been dealing with it for 5 years.
With 2 active kids, Michelle Backus has her hands full for sure, especially with her autistic son, Benji, who has a secret the family tried to hide. It's a puzzle that researchers are trying to solve. When did you think it was weird of what he was eating?
I'd have to say probably around 2.5 or so.
Benji also has pica. It's a disorder that gives him an appetite for items not found in the pantry. Things that aren't food.
Things that aren't food, yep.
Like what?
Grass and dirt. He'll swallow small pebbles. He chews on sticks. He'll eat crayons and Play-Doh and glue and our toothpaste and our shampoo and our dish soap.
Reality shows like My Strange Addiction sparked a lot of curiosity about those who will eat anything from glass to even pillow cushions. But for doctors, little is known about pica or what causes it.
So it could be common in any children, but frequently there are populations that are more at risk for it.
Dr. Philip Basie is an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Utah. He says pica will often surface out of nowhere, and you may not believe some of the things people with pica will eat.
Hair, burnt matches, cigarette butts is another common one.
There are theories on what may cause pica. Mineral deficiencies and mental illness are 2 possibilities. For Benji's mom, though, his compulsive eating is one more thing that keeps her up at night.
He's already had to have 2 colonoscopies and 2 endoscopies.
Medical problems aside, Michelle says pica affects what the family does in public. She says it's hard not to notice a kid eating dirt at a park. And with critical looks and questions thrown her way, it's hard to hide her embarrassment.
I tend to feel embarrassed in a way, because then they're all staring at him thinking, why is he doing that? I've had people actually ask to be moved in a restaurant, so you know that they're moving because of you.
While the looks affect Michelle, Benji appears happy in his own little world, even as he lives with 2 medical disorders not fully understood.
I think you have to learn to that. You have to accept the child for what he's going to be. And, as long as he's happy and he's thriving, you just, be happy for him.
For now, they lock up any dangerous temptations for Benji and hope the disorder will lessen with time. Mary Nichols, 2 News.
Our next argument for and against the use of restraints will come from Miguel and Amanda.
The use of restraints, seclusion, and other restrictive procedures as systematic strategies to manage severe problem behavior is not only unethical, but can also be considered a human rights concern. Furthermore, the liberty of a person with a disability is at stake, and all too often, these procedures are used rather than skill development or environmental enhancement procedures. Sections 4.08 and 4.09 of the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts clearly states that behavior analysts should recommend reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible, and must offer the least restrictive procedures. Behavior analysts are bound by these codes and must adhere to them at all times. So it's important to keep these 2 specific codes in mind as this debate progresses. A study conducted by Weber, McVilly, and Chan from 2011 reported on issues regarding the misuse of these restrictive procedures in various disability service providers in Victoria, Australia, over a 12-month period. More specifically, it examined the abuse, overuse, and implementation of chemical restraints. For example, intense psychotropic medication, as well as sedation. It was reported that aside from physical restraint, chemical restraints were among the most common, with the use of psychotropic medication the most frequently reported form of chemical restraint. And to be clear, the definition of a chemical restraint, according to the Children's Health Act of 2000, is, and I quote, a drug or medication used on an individual to control behavior or restrict freedom of movement that is not A, prescribed by a licensed physician for the standard treatment of an individual's medical or psychiatric condition, and B, administered as prescribed by that licensed physician, end quote. The authors reported that for many people that are subject to these restraints, it is a routine procedure rather than used as an emergency situation. As you can see in this bar graph, there were a staggering 25,578 episodes of chemical restraints for various reasons, and this doesn't include the episodes that went unreported. The fact that there were over 7 times the amount of instances of chemical restraint than the next method used, which was mechanical, should be alarming and raise some red flags. This indicates that this was simply a routine for the staff to use on a daily basis. For example, take a look at this next bar graph, which displays the number of incidents of chemical restraints according to the type of administration. For each and every month, the overwhelming majority of the administrations were a routine procedure rather than a procedure used on an as-needed basis or for an emergency situation. Within the 12-month period that Weber, McVilly, and Chan conducted their study, episodes of chemical restraint accounted for 83% of all incidents reported, while the rest were mechanical restraints and the use of seclusion. Clearly, there was a preference for the use of mechanical restraints. Perhaps the staff perceived them as more of a more ethical means of restraining the clients and managing problem behavior. However, a restraint is just that, a restraint, which is a measure or condition that keeps something or someone under control or within limits. The fact that a mechanical restraint does not physically take hold of an individual does not make it any more ethical than the use of a mechanical restraint. Overall, this study emphasized and highlighted the growing concerns of the misuse and overuse of restrictive procedures. Again, I would argue that these procedures not only blatantly violate sections of the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code, but also violate basic human rights and liberties that we as humans should all be subjected to.
It has been discussed that restraints are unethical and ineffective. A study by Weber found that mechanical restraints accounted for only 11% of all incidents reported. Most reports of mechanical restraints were in response to emergency situations or only as needed. A study by Oliver and co-authors estimated that up to 14% of individuals with disabilities engage in self-injurious behavior, also known as SIB. SIB can result in abrasions like bite marks, scratches, and bruises, which may lead to infection and scarring. More serious results include callus formation, hematomas, and bone spurs. Restraints are often used to prevent such injuries from occurring and have been shown to reduce the frequency of SIB by increasing response effort. The ethics surrounding restraints has led to a stigma against restraints. Restraints are seen by most as being unethical, ineffective, and cruel. With a heaping amount of horror stories of restraints being used incorrectly, people are against them while there are bad instances of inappropriate restraint use, though benefits outweigh the cons. If restraints are used correctly and follow the BACB's Compliance Code 4.09, which uses the least restrictive procedures possible, restraints can be effective and ethical. In hopes to alleviate the negative side effects of mechanical restraints while exploiting the benefits of restraints, in 1997, Fisher and co-authors introduced restraint fading. Restraint fading involves the use of restrictive restraints that don't allow for SIB and systematically decreases restrictiveness by manipulating the rigidness of the restraints until the restraints no longer prevent SIB. Even though the individual is now able to engage in SIB, rates remain low because stimulus control has been transferred during the restraint fading process. The study by Fisher and co-authors evaluated the effectiveness of canvas variation of arm splints that were designed to prevent hand-to-hand SIB. The splints consisted of canvas sleeves, which were placed on the participant's arms from wrist to armpit. They included 4 pockets on each splint. Each splint could hold up to 5 thin stays or 1 thick stay. The stays consist of flat metal rods, measure the length of the canvas splints, Fisher and co-authors found that this design made it possible to manipulate the flexibility of the arm splints by adding or removing the number of rods in each pocket. The results of pre-fading and post-fading analysis suggested that a transfer of stimulus control had occurred during the fading process. The fading process was effective in maintaining low rates of SIB, while it allowed increased arm movement. Fisher and others found that restraint fading had several advantages. It reduces the risk of injury from SIB and minimize the detrimental physical impact of wearing restraint devices for long periods of time by gradually reducing rigidity. One drawback to restraint fading is the amount of time necessary to start with full rigid restraints and the following process of systematically decreasing the rigidness of the restraints. Although Fisher and co-authors use a systematic method of fading, not all researchers begin the fading process at the most restrictive level of rigidity, which doesn't follow Compliance Code 4.09, which promotes the least restrictive method. In many studies, the initial level of restrictiveness is often arbitrarily or is selected arbitrarily, or the initial level is not specified. A more systematic approach for the starting point of restraint fading is necessary to be more time efficient and determine the level of rigidness of restraints necessary for each individual to decrease the rates of SIB. In 1999, Wallace and co-authors developed a rapid restraint analysis developed to evaluate the effects of different levels of rigidness on rates of SIB and adaptive behavior. The goal of this analysis was to identify the optimal level of splint flexion for each participant that effectively decreased SIB, but still permitted the mission of adaptive behavior like drinking from a cup. The analysis was time efficient, only taking 120 minutes to complete for each participant. Duchesne and co-authors conducted a study in 2015 using rapid restraint analysis to determine the optimal level of splint flexion for 10 participants. 8 out of the 10 participants were discharged at a level of flexion that was equal to or less restrictive than the rapid restraint analysis level. For all 10 participants, rapid restraint analysis identified a level of flexion that was less restrictive than the rigid splints like the thick metal rods. Although 2 of the 10 participants left wearing more restrictive levels of flexion, according to Duchesne and co-authors, it is reasonable to conduct that rapid restraint analysis was a helpful assessment tool for the majority of participants and might have prevented exposure to unnecessary restrictive measures. The most important implication is that rapid restraint analysis might help to ensure that practitioners implement the least restrictive procedures possible while the safety of individuals with severe SIB is maintained.
So Amanda mentioned code 4.09 that emphasizes the use of least restrictive procedures. However, the various examples that she provided seem to have clearly violated the use of this particular code. It's true that they seem to be relatively effective in reducing the self-injurious behavior of the participants in each study. However, the process of getting to those reduced rates incorporated what I interpreted as very restrictive procedures that were eventually faded out. It's also been reported that the use of restraints and other restrictive procedures can lead to psychological damage and physical injury, as noted by a recent study conducted by Trader and her colleagues. Those two very important variables need to be taken into consideration and should not be overlooked. I'd be curious to know if the authors of the studies you referenced considered code 4.09 as well as any physical or psychological damage that could have directly resulted from the implementation of the physical restraint procedures.
Nicole and myself will be presenting the last argument for and against the use of restraints.
Sorry.
Okay, so
According to an article
in
in Clinical Psychology and Science, demographic discusses how the use of restraint can include use of power by staff and unwarranted use. She reported that participants in residential care depended on staff for most of their daily needs and reported being at the whim of staff moods. So because participants are dependent on staff, this gives staff the power to dictate. And if they're having a bad day or facing personal issues, they could potentially bring that to work, and the residents suffer repercussions as well. In our Bailey and Birch ethics textbook, the opening sentence on page 3 states, "There is nothing more shocking and horrific than the abuse and maltreatment of people unable to control." Some participants at the residency center felt that incidents were used for purposes of punishment and control by staff. Parent was reported saying, "I reckon some of the staff here might seclude people just to sit there in charge." Our core ethical principle is to do no harm and to respect autonomy and promote independence. The participant was asked what could have been done to prevent his aggressive behavior. He replied, "They could have took me into my room and spoke to me. That's what they could have done. It would have helped me and could have helped them as well." So that coincides with my last point, which is many support staff have little knowledge of challenging behavior and report that received training does not adequately prepare them for their job. It is important to remind ourselves of Ethics Code 1.02 and how, as behavior analysts, we are to be operating within our boundaries of competence. If we are inadequately trained and implementing such procedures, we are clearly operating outside of our boundaries. Created in the PowerPoint titled Ethics and Foundations of ABA, which was uploaded by Professor back in week 1, module 1. Slide 13 states that the BACB and our ethical compliance codes were established due to poor training and supervision of staff at the Sunland Training Center in Florida. It revealed abuse, use of aversive consequences, and death of residents. The following is a video clip which presents some alarming statistics. I chose this video because I wanted to give you folks a better example of how undertrained staff contribute to such high numbers and deaths of children.
Kids can be really hard to deal with, especially other people's kids. Like when you're a teacher and have to deal with several of them at once. And apparently teachers in Connecticut are having such a tough time dealing with kids in public schools that they're actually putting them into restraints and seclusion rooms, like the kids are mental patients or something. They do it so much, in fact, that a new report from the state just found that over the past 3 years, Connecticut has recorded more than 90,000 instances of restraining and secluding kids in school. Apparently, tying kids down and locking them into cells has become a pervasive norm. The report found that kids in Connecticut sustained more than 1,300 injuries from these practices, and at least 24 of them were serious. Investigators closely explored the cases of 70 kids for the report, and the facts are just mind-blowing. Take the case of a 9-year-old with autism who was placed in seclusion after refusing to say hello to a visitor, or a 4-year-old boy with developmental issues who was restrained after throwing puzzle pieces. In that particular school, the policy is that kids can be shackled to orthopedic chairs to restrain them. That's the actual policy. A grader with autism was constantly thrown into a seclusion room, and while he was in there, he would make suicidal gestures, like wrapping a shoelace around his neck and repeating, "I want to die." This is a 4th grader with autism, mind you. But the worst case from the report has to be the fact that one child was restrained more than 700 times over the course of 1 year. That means the kid was tied up about twice a day. It was part of his routine, apparently, like lunch or recess. Time to get tied down again. The worst part about this report is that it's nothing new. Last year, an investigation by ProPublica and NPR showed that restraining kids and throwing them into cells goes way beyond just Connecticut. They found that in just one school year across the country, kids were restrained and secluded at least 267,000 times. And that's just the number that was reported. The investigators feel pretty certain the actual number is a lot higher. They found that 20 kids have died from these practices, and that children with physical, emotional, or intellectual disabilities account for about 3/4 of the cases. The fact that we put mental patients into restraints and seclusion rooms is bad enough. Doing it to kids is just criminal, no matter how hard they are to deal with. Tonight, let's talk about that.
So Nicole stated some abuses of power in regards to restraints. However, Hedgemanek conducted an 18-month ethnographic study that was published in 2010 on a residential treatment center for adolescents with mental health illnesses. She pointed out that over 50,000 adolescents are removed from their home and placed in residential facilities due to violent and aggressive behaviors seen in multiple settings. Many of these adolescents would have been placed in juvenile detention, but rather they were sent to intensive treatment centers for care. Restraints or holds are used within the facilities to subdue dangerous behaviors, posing a threat to others or oneself. The techniques were used as a way to immobilize the body so no harm or further harm may be done. After the incident of a restraint, residents and program facilitators engaged in individual and group talk therapies. They engage in conversations about what led up to the restraint, what happened during the restraint, and what happened after the restraint. During the course of this study, Hedgemanek noted changes in the relationship between staff and adolescents involved in restraints. Individuals would frequently high-five, fist bump, or hug staff members who had previously restrained them. When asked about negative feelings towards those who have held them in physical restraints, many residents referenced their own out-of-control behavior resulting in those actions and that the restraint was for their benefit. So many residents would equate being held to other forms of affection because it was for their benefit in the long run. This, coupled with talk therapy and reflection after the restraint, helped to foster positive relationships between residents and staff members, forming an intimate bond.
Okay, thanks, Kyla. So though you state that there are instances where restraints decreased harm to self and or others, cases where the opposite is true and we can actually be doing a disservice to the kids we serve by restraining and or secluding them. As we saw in the video I presented, there were 20 deaths in the last 5 years, so 1 death every 3 months. The video also touched on how a 4th grader displayed suicidal tendencies by making threats to take his own life. And according to the Government of Accountability Office, for weeks, a 13-year-old boy hung himself with a cord that was provided by his teacher for him to use as a belt. Restraints and seclusions may also contribute to an increase in self-harming behaviors. Lastly, in regards to when you state that residents equate being held, also known as being physically restrained, many with autism have comorbid diagnosis, which may include sensory processing disorders. This may also lead them to feeling overly sensitive to touch, and with that, they may prefer to abstain from physical contact. Many also have autism coupled with ADHD, which could also make it difficult for them to sit for prolonged periods of time to engage in talk therapy. So back to Amanda.
Amanda will summarize the pro side of our argument, followed by Nicole summarizing the con side.
To summarize her pro restraints, when response blocking is implemented for pica behavior, the result was a significant decrease in successful pica attempts. Restraint baiting with the use of rapid restraint analysis was effective in reducing SIB in 8 out of 10 participants. And finally, restraints can build relationships between staff and clients by being calming and caring during the restraint, and with the use of restraint, or the use of therapy following the use of restraint.
Okay, so the key points that were touched on by myself, Miguel, and Jeremy in regards to why restraints and seclusion should not be used is 1, secluding students within an educational setting can prevent students from receiving academic instruction, and problem behaviors may actually stem from not understanding the content that is being presented. With that, seclusion can also serve as reinforcement for escape behaviors. 2, it is often ineffective, stressful, and unethical. And 3, can include abuses of power by staff and those who are in positions of authority. Not to mention, when staff are inadequately trained, restraining students can prove to be fatal.
Thank you guys for watching our debate. We look forward to answering any questions you may have.